welcome. My name's Leah Phillips and I'm delighted that you're here to join us for episode 6 of our Break the Isolation webinar series. This episode is titled Wellbeing and Connection During Social Isolation with our special guest, Greta Bradman. Now, before we begin today, we would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and to their cultures and to elders both past, present and emerging. Thank you again for joining us today. This webinar series aims to bring together our community, keep us connected, share creative ideas throughout this time. You can get involved today as well by asking questions and sharing ideas with other participants via our live chat function just at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have some time for your questions towards the end of this webinar. Now joining us today, without further ado, is Greta Bradman, one of Australia's much loved operatic sopranos, a host with ABC Classic FM, and a registered psychologist practicing here in Melbourne. Welcome, Greta Bradman. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey Leah, it is awesome to be with you.
Great. So I guess to start off, most of our viewers will probably know you from your roles with ABC Classic FM as a broadcaster and as a soprano, but I suspect most people probably don't know that you're also a trained psychologist. So what drew you towards psychology along with your other endeavours and what excites you about it?
I think probably the same thing drew me to psychology as it drew me toward music, and particularly classical singing, which is just that connection between people and looking at how to support that connection. So I did my undergrad psych alongside my undergrad music and didn't actually intend to have a career as a singer at all. When I was doing my master's and PhD in psychology, I sort of thought, you know what, I might actually sing for a few years when I finish my studies and then circle back to psychology. And that's what I've done. So I spent the last decade or so working really hard as a singer and just immersing myself in that world, but also keeping my registration up as a psych. And yeah, now I'm, I guess, kind of transitioning across in order to spend most of my time in the world of mental health and well-being. I find it a really exciting place, and I'm particularly interested, I suppose, in that world when it comes to the performing arts. It's something that is, really relevant at the moment, of course, and I think that it's something that all of us would be wise to, I guess, focus on and treat a little bit similarly to how we would treat our physical health.
Yeah, great. So again, it's just so good to have you here to talk about this today and share all your ideas and tips around wellness and connection during this, kind of crazy time we find ourselves in. You mentioned mental health there. Shall we just start with that? And what just is mental health and why is it so important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a long time, people kind of thought of mental health as almost being one and the same as mental illness. But if you think about what you mean when you say physical health, it probably brings to mind a physical state that you aspire towards. So being physically well, so you can get about your day. Being in an optimal physical health can differ between different people. It doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. It depends on various factors from age to genetics and environment. And mental health is very much the same. And mental health should be something that we, I think, engage with and incline towards as something to aspire to in terms of what is optimal mental health for us and what can we do to contribute towards, I guess, sustaining good mental health. I wanted to share with you actually the World Health Organization definition of mental health. For starters, they say that good mental health is related to mental and psychological well-being. But they go further than that. They define mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So it's a really positive, sort of aspirational definition given by the World Health Organization. And I think it goes straight to the dynamic components of mental health and well-being as something that's not static, that is very much impacted on by, you know, features both within us, but in like more than anything probably by our environment. And of course, that's where at the moment in this state of physical isolation, and there's a lot of change going on and a lot of uncertainty and factors that are quite extraordinary to our lives. And all of those are going to have an impact on our mental health and well-being. And so it's probably, maybe it's never been so important to really incline toward, okay, so what can we do?
Yeah. So, you know, what can we do to maintain or develop good mental health during this time?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing I would say is that people's responses, and I've certainly seen this in my own practice, people's responses to this particular time, they vary greatly, and there's no right or wrong, you know, way to respond. It's a very personal thing. Some people are actually experiencing a sense of calm and are quite enjoying the simplicity and slow pace of life at the moment, even some of those who are facing a lower income. Some, though, are experiencing feelings of great anxiety and that sense of anticipatory grief, or, you know, not necessarily about losing people, but about losing life as they've known it so far, or worrying that that's maybe going to be an outcome. Some feel a sense of helplessness, or, you know, a feeling of being saddened that they can't somehow do more, but this can maybe lead to folks being less inclined to actually just looking at the small things that they can do within their sphere of influence that they might otherwise manage to achieve. So these feelings of anxiety or helplessness or grief, or even guilt over not feeling these emotions, they're all absolutely normal, as well as you know, problems with sleep, and our relationships with others can be challenged as well. So I suppose the first thing that I want to mention that you can do in service of helping with your mental health and well-being is actively building in new habits. And you can think about these habits in terms of, I guess, specific areas of your life. And, you know, on the one hand, what I'm about to talk about probably seems quite kind of like obvious, but it's also, I think, really challenging. And I think it's challenging for each of us in different ways. And so we need to be there to support each other around building healthy habits. And I would encourage you to think about maybe just one person out there who you could collaborate with around developing some of these habits. So there's areas of your life that I mentioned. Think physical health, mental health, supporting your creativity, and social connection. So in some ways, the social connection piece is a little bit covered off by actually using this as a collaborative opportunity around collaborating in helping you develop your habits and rituals in your day, and helping your friend or family member in supporting them with their habits and rituals in their day. We know, the next thing I'd say is, we know that physical and mental health are quite intertwined. Physical exercise is one of the first things that a psychologist will check in on with someone who's experiencing, for instance, symptoms of depression. So that idea of behavioural activation, it's really important to mood. So make sure, for the sake of both physical health and also your mental health, that you get a half hour of moderate exercise every day. That might mean going for a walk by yourself or with a friend. It can take various forms, but just look for that half hour. It can even be broken up into little bits.
Yeah, great.
And I would say go for like 3 days if you can, where you get yourself puffing. So it's a little bit more kind of active.
Yeah, great. Oh, that's such a good tip. You mentioned before, when you were just speaking about, you said physical isolation rather than social isolation, and I've heard a few people mentioning, you know, using the different phrase. So why would you prefer using the physical isolation phrase, and advocate for us changing the language around that, you know, notion in the media that's just, it's said, you know, thousands of times a day?
Yeah. And you know what? I think in a way, the fact that we are looking to kind of shift the language, that in itself is an opportunity. So it's an opportunity that wouldn't have been there had we been sort of referring to it as physical isolation from the get-go. And I think the distinction that that we're looking to make when we talk about physical isolation as opposed to social isolation is, whilst we are physically isolated from one another and away from one another, that doesn't mean that we can't socially connect. And in fact, finding ways that are playful, that are creative, that are meaningful, of maintaining social connection during this time is actually really important. And in fact, Leo, you know, one of the things that I wanted to touch on today was, which is jumping ahead a bit because I do want to touch on some more habits, but is the idea that how you interact with those people who are nearest and dearest to you has a big impact on the physiological response of your body and the influence that that has on how you feel. So this is particularly relevant, I guess, to the hormone called oxytocin, which is known as the love hormone or the connection hormone. Shall I get into that now and circle back to habits, or would you like me to?
Let's stay on this, and we'll get back to habits. So
Love it.
I jumped
All
ahead
right.
as well. It's too
Yeah,
excited.
no. Yeah. So when you think about oxytocin, and there's been some really interesting research around what happens when we communicate in different ways. So oxytocin, as I say, it's the connection hormone or the love hormone. And when you connect with someone who is nearest and dearest, particularly when you have that body language and that ability to see their face, you can actually have a release of oxytocin. Oxytocin leaves you feeling sort of loved, I suppose, and connected more with the other person. So when you are talking with someone via, say, video chat or even on the phone, you're likely to get a hit of oxytocin. Whereas if you communicate via text or via messaging or email, you don't get the same hit of oxytocin. And so what I would say around this, and this is around social connection, and it does kind of come into that habitual area as well, is when you connect with someone and have that felt sense of connection, or even something that you might call love, that is the love hormone, oxytocin, being released into your system. And as I say, there's research to suggest that when you connect and you can see that other person, or at least you can hear their voice, so you're getting some of those social cues for them, you do have that hit over and above what you would get if you just kind of text. So I would say, for the sake of yourself, but also for the sake of others around you, if there are people in your life who you might catch up with every couple of months over, you know, for a cuppa or something like that, it might feel a bit strange, but reach out to them at the moment and suggest, hey, how about we catch up, you know, via FaceTime or Zoom or whatever it might be. As I say, it might feel strange because it is somewhat unusual, but just remember that this is as much for them as it is for you. We're all in this together. And connection at this time around playful and creative things, as much as debriefing on how you're going and how they're going, is really important. So when you hear about people getting together to like have a jam, if it's, you know, around music, or to have a dance, that's fantastic. You know, adding that element of play to that social connection is really important. And as I say, it will support the release of oxytocin, the feel-good love hormone, which in turn can have an impact on everything from immune response through to reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety, and also a response on other feel-good neurotransmitters being serotonin and dopamine.
Well, that's really interesting. I think everyone's using video chat more and more these days, but it's great to know that, you know, we should be using it even more than sending an email or sending a text. Or great. Shall we get back to some of the other behaviors we were talking about before?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about habits, and I suggested that you sort of break down habits into buckets. So you've got your physical habits, but now the mental, the mental habits, I want to further break down into several areas. So for starters, there's sleep, and I could spend the next hour talking about sleep. One thing I want to say is sleep for a lot of people at the moment mightn't be like what normal sleep means for them, but just try and make sure that you create a routine around sleep. So have a bedtime and stick to it. So that might be different for, you know, different nights of the week, but just be clear in your mind in advance what your bedtime routine is and what your bedtime is. Think about avoiding blue light for 90 minutes before you go to bed. No devices in the bedroom. And also think about, you know, we know that alcohol is both a stimulant and a depressant or a relaxant. So even though alcohol might help you get to sleep, it will inhibit your ability or reduce your ability to cycle through the 4 stages of sleep. You'll spend a lot less time getting the really refreshing rapid eye movements stage of sleep, or REM sleep. And that can mean that you wake up feeling like you've really not even slept at all. And which in turn can have an impact on your mental health and well-being and your ability to concentrate or your willingness to get up and do some exercise. So making sure that you think of sleep as a real basis, a sort of a foundation, is really important. Now, another thing that I want to talk about on the mental health side and the habits to support that is around habits involving social media and information sources. So it's tempting. It's really super tempting. I see if this rings true for you, Leah. To think that more information equates with being better informed and more able to cope and respond well. Is that something that...
I'm somewhere in the middle, but I do know, you know, some friends of mine just need to know it all and just sort of have, you know, 24-hour news cycle going on, you know, various devices all the time. And but I suppose it's different for different people. I would cope differently. But yeah, for me, there's a lot going on. So I try to switch off when I can. But yeah, what would be your advice about?
Yeah, well, I think that's fantastic. Yeah, so some people are sort of taking that really kind of wise. I know how it makes me feel when I really engage with a lot of this stuff. So, and it makes me feel more anxious. So I'm going to switch off. And I would highly recommend being really judicious and mindful as to how you do respond to the information that you come across. So be disciplined in not going after a lot of news sources. Notice when you get stressed out or you start feeling helpless as a result of engaging with certain information, and actively avoid some of that information. It's one time where avoidance is not necessarily a bad thing. So establish, you know, what is within my circle of control and my circle of influence, and how do I want to contribute to those circles? What information enables me to positively contribute to my life and the life of those within my circle of influence? And pursue information that supports those things. Also remember that we as humans are much better at hooking onto negative information. So for every, you know, one piece of negative information we get, we might need 5 or even 7 pieces of positive information to engage with it to the same extent. So when you hook onto negative information and you sort of find yourself getting into a cascade of thoughts of what ifs and if onlys that flows from that piece of information, and it should be different, then that can help activate your threat response. And in turn, what happens next is we then filter for other negative information within our sphere. And at the moment, there's an abundance of possible threats to attend to, from, you know, everything from thinking about, I suppose, you know, germs, to the threat of financial difficulty, or you know, worries about family members and loved ones. So a couple of things here. First, go looking for good news. So actively add good news to your information diet. And there are a couple of Instagram links that I love.
Okay.
I follow Reasons to Be Cheerful. Now, Reasons to Be Cheerful, it's on Instagram, but there's also a website. So if you type in Reasons to Be Cheerful, I like, they live up to their name. It's just wonderful. It's a good news channel, really.
Nice. I
And
think
then
we all need a bit more of that type of content in our daily
yeah,
life. So yeah,
yeah,
can't wait to look
absolutely.
it up.
And then Happify. So Happify is another one, which is really great. The other things I would say is, when it comes to attention trading, it's not something that necessarily comes naturally to all of us. And this is one of the things around mindfulness. I won't take you through a mindfulness exercise today, but I do have a couple of suggestions for you in terms of apps and in terms of resources. I'll give those to you, and then I'll explain why I think they're so great. So one, which is a paid resource, which has been just going gangbusters and seems to be resonating with a lot of people, including a lot of people within the creative industries, is called Waking Up with Sam Harris. So Sam is a neuroscientist, a philosopher, and a New York Times bestseller. And Waking Up with Sam Harris, his mindfulness app, just seems to be a very sort of listenable experience for a lot of people. Calm is another one, which is just really beautiful and will help. It helps you through things like, watching rain and sort of listening to the sound of water and looking at it dripping off leaves. It does a great job of helping you shift your attention to where you intend it to be.
Oh, that's great. So it's a bit more of a visual mindfulness rather than the listening kind of ones. Oh, great.
Yeah, correct. So that's kind of another angle for people who prefer sort of a visual component. And then there are some other really great mindfulness apps. So there's Buddhify, and then here an fantastic Australian app, of course, is Smiling Mind, which is, rolled out in many schools, but it's also fantastic for adults. So just quickly, one of the things that I really like about mindfulness is, in essence, what it is an opportunity to train yourself to kind of strengthen the attention muscle. It does many other things as well, but I just really want to focus on this at this moment. And our ability to notice where our mind has gone. It might be off to thoughts, it might be off to noises in our environment, wherever it's gone, and just gently bring our attention back to where we intend it to be. And to bring our attention back as though we were a curious scientist observing something for the first time. So it might be, our breath, or it might be leaves, or, whatever it is. And it's just the opportunity with any mindfulness exercise. And this is one thing that I really want to leave you with before perhaps we get to some questions shortly, is that idea that the opportunity is actually in shifting our attention back to where we intend it to be. That's not, if your mind wanders, that's not some failure on your part when it comes to doing mindfulness exercises. That is the practice of bringing your attention back time and time again.
Yeah, great. I think we will probably have some questions now, but maybe I'll just ask one more question before we go into that. If you have a question and you're watching, just type it into the chat function on the webinar here, and we'll try and get to it as best as we can. Gosh, one more from me. Maybe, it's pretty safe to say that we're all here in this webinar today because we're involved in music or performing arts in some way. How can those disciplines positively influence our wellness, or how can we harness our experience in those areas to help us?
One thing I would say at the moment is, because I could talk a lot about the research around, both what music and the performing arts do positively for mental health in the community. And I could also talk about the pressures, the industry pressures within the performing arts, which can mean that people who work in the performing arts as their profession, those pressures can impact upon mental health in potentially negative ways. So it's kind of like this cross section here, where music and the performing arts itself can be really super positive for mental health, but at the same time, the pressures of being in the industry can be not so good for mental health. So I would say at the moment, one of the things when, you know, for anyone working within the performing arts or working as a musician, or and I know this is something that I try and do myself as well, and I encourage those around me to do, is separate out your creativity and your music and your musicianship from the pressures that you see around you. So when you go to play your instrument, or say you're a teacher and you're working with your students, just spend time being really curious around the music itself, and just, again, bringing your attention back time and time again to the act of creating the music, and just accept the thoughts when they come up, if they come up around the industry pressures, which are, you know, profound at the moment. When they come up, just acknowledge them and bring your attention back to where you intend it to be. So to really separate out those two components, recognize that they're not one and the same, and that this is a time to really dig down into the creativity. There's also, you know, there are going to be some times where you need to actually actively attend to other areas of your work, but to try and kind of separate those out as much as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we throw to some questions? Thank you for that advice. It's really you know, a great idea to separate the two and just, you know, utilize this time to focus in on, you know, on your practice. We've got a question that kind of comes under from a teacher. Would you recommend mindfulness activities to autistic students? She has several piano students on the spectrum that often focus on playing, but when they're done, you know, they just jump off the bench and they're done. You know, I suppose it kind of ties into how if we notice, you know, things that aren't quite normal behaviors perhaps within some of our students, if they're teachers, like how can we try and help them in some ways safely, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that with any students who have special needs, I would always be inclined to have a discussion with their parents and with the, you know, probably the experts and the practitioners who are working with that young person, and take their lead on what is right for that student, because, you know, there can be big differences between one person with special needs and another. So I hope that's not a cop-out answer, teacher out there, but I think that it's great that you're thinking around, you know, how you can help young people who have special needs transition from their lesson back into, I guess, you know, the world outside that little bubble of music. And indeed, there might be something really special that you can do there. And I would encourage you both to explore that with the people who know those young people the best, and also to share that as part of your social rituals at the moment and your connection with other teachers as well.
Yeah, terrific advice. Another one that rings true for me with my, you know, rehearsals and things when, you know, when we could rehearse in groups, is someone has asked that I find that I have trouble going to sleep after coming home from rehearsals. You know, is that normal, and what strategies could I use to help me fall asleep?
That is super normal. That is, yeah, it's completely normal. I mean, the other thing I would say is that if someone's working in an office job and say they finish even at 7 p.m, they're probably not going to be going to bed until 10. So the idea that we can suddenly, you know, like finish a late night rehearsal, go home, hop into bed, it's a challenge. It is a challenge. So I would say that for starters, think about those things, again, the idea of ritualizing bedtime. So think about those things that do help you, and try and identify also those things that you do that might not help, but you do in sort of an attempt to help. So for instance, scrolling, you know, mindlessly through your phone for a long time, things like that. So try and get rid of devices in the bedroom. Try to make sure that you haven't had alcohol in the 3 hours before you go to bed. So post rehearsal, avoid alcohol, avoid caffeine after after the middle of the day. But I would say, as well as that, go for it, find someone's voice that really resonates with you, like on a mindfulness app, and go through a mindfulness meditation as you go to bed. That would be my number one pick. And then just gradually experiment and piece together a ritual around sleep that involves some mindfulness, maybe a warm cup of something completely not caffeinated. You can even look for tryptophan rich foods, so things like seeds and nuts, or maybe a glass of milk, which is really rich in tryptophan. And also just make sure that you get up at a good time, so that you're actually kind of setting yourself up, and start by setting up the morning ritual in order to support the evening. But I hear you, the evening rehearsal, it makes it tricky to have.
Yeah, and those on our website we've actually listed all the mindfulness apps that Greta has mentioned today. So if you go to ameb.edu.au/break the isolation, there'll be links to those mindfulness resources there. I think that's kind of all we might have time for today, but thank you so much, Greta, for all of your expertise today and for spending some time with us.
My great pleasure. I just want to mention one thing, which is if you want to access the help of a psychologist, at the moment, if you go along to see your GP and you receive a referral, which means you have a mental health care plan, then you can get 6 appointments with a psychologist that are either bulk billed via telehealth, a consultation a bit like this, really. Or you can have a rebate, a Medicare rebate. So that's really good news. And I also want to say, Beyond Blue, for any resources on mental health and wellbeing, they're so great. They also have a long list of numbers around for helplines and so forth. And finally, the Support Act Wellbeing Helpline, which are psychologists and counsellors, highly trained and also specific for people who work within the performing arts. You can call 1-800-959-500 and talk to someone right now, or you can actually make an appointment for later. And all of those clinicians aren't just highly trained mental health practitioners, they are also trained around issues and pressures specific to musicians and performing artists.
Well, terrific. Thank you for that, Greta. And all of those resources, Beyond Blue, Arts Wellbeing Collective, Support Act, Helpline, all those numbers can also be found on our website, ameb.edu.au/break the isolation. So they're all there for you. But thanks again to today's wonderful guest, Greta Bradman. Thank you to our team working behind the scenes today. Thank you so much. And last but not least, thank you to everyone who joined us today. It's terrific to have you in this webinar. Stay well, stay connected, everyone, and we look forward to your company next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.